She had been trained to endure. That was the first lesson drilled into every recruit who stepped onto the hallowed grounds of the military base. Endurance of the physical, the mental, and the emotional was the currency of respect. Private First Class Eva Rostova understood this currency better than most. At 22, she was the youngest soldier in her unit, a signals intelligence analyst with a sharp mind and a quieter disposition than her peers. She was also the only woman in the artillery battalion's forward observation company, a fact that had never been a secret to anyone, least of all to her. Her days were a meticulous cycle of drills, maintenance, and intelligence briefings. She had carved a space for herself through competence. When the encrypted comms failed during a simulated bombardment, it was Eva who re-established the link. When the targeting data needed cross-referencing at 3 in the morning, her reports were flawless. She didn't ask for special treatment, and she certainly didn't expect any. She believed her work would speak for itself, building a fortress of professionalism around her. The fortress, however, had a chink in its armor. His name was Commander Thorne. A man in his late 40s, Thorne was a veteran of 2 conflicts, his chest a mosaic of ribbons that spoke of bravery and service. To the outside world, he was the epitome of a seasoned commander, tough, fair, and uncompromising. But behind the closed doors of his office and in the quiet corners of the motor pool, a different man existed. He was a man who wielded his rank like a cudgel, especially against those he deemed weaker. He had a particular disdain for women in combat roles, a prejudice he barely bothered to conceal. He called it maintaining standards, but Eva and a few others recognized it for what it was, a petty, simmering cruelty. The first few months were a war of attrition fought with microaggressions. Thorne would critique her uniform when it was immaculate, assign her the most grueling guard shifts, and interrupt her during briefings to ask if she really understood the data. Eva absorbed it all, her jaw tight, her responses clipped and professional. She reported to her immediate superior, Lieutenant Coles, a fair but overworked man who advised her to pick her battles. So she did. She chose to fight with excellence. But excellence was a poor shield against a man determined to break her. And the incident that would become legend began on a Tuesday. The battalion was preparing for a major readiness inspection. The air was thick with tension, a palpable electricity that crackled between the soldiers as they polished brass, inspected vehicles, and ran through checklists. Eva was in the communications hut, running a diagnostic on a frequency-hopping radio. Her focus was absolute, her fingers dancing across the keypad as lines of code scrolled on the monitor. She didn't hear him enter. The first indication she had of his presence was the sharp, searing pain at the back of her scalp. Thorne had grabbed a fistful of her long chestnut hair, which she kept tightly wound in a regulation bun. With a brutal yank, he pulled her backward, her chair scraping against the concrete floor. Her neck snapped back, a shock of pain radiating down her spine. "What is this?" he snarled, his face inches from hers. His breath was hot and sour with coffee. "A goddamn hair commercial? You think we have time for you to be pretty?" He gave her hair another vicious tug, forcing tears of pain to her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "This is a distraction, a liability. Get it cut. Now." He released her so suddenly that she lurched forward, catching herself on the edge of the metal desk. He stood over her for a moment, his chest heaving, waiting for a reaction. He wanted to see her crumble, to cry, to protest. He wanted the satisfaction of breaking the unbreakable. But Eva did none of those things. She didn't touch her stinging scalp. She didn't look away from the monitor. With a steady hand that belied the earthquake of fury and humiliation shaking her core, she reached up and calmly retied her bun, tighter than before. Then, she turned her head slowly and met his gaze. Her eyes were not filled with tears, but with a cold, clear light he had never seen before. It was the light of a decision being made. She didn't say a word. She simply turned back to her work, her fingers resuming their dance across the keypad as if he had already ceased to exist. For a fleeting second, something flickered in Thorne's eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or the first icy tendril of doubt. He had expected noise. He had received silence. And silence, when you are a tyrant, is the most terrifying response of all. He stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the equipment on the shelves. The news of the hair pulling spread through the base with the speed of a radio signal. In the mess hall, whispers replaced the usual clatter of trays. In the barracks, opinions were divided. Some of the older soldiers, friends of Thorne, muttered that he was old school, and that she probably needed the discipline. But a larger, quieter group, the young privates, the non-commissioned officers who had seen Thorne's temper before, and the few other women on the base, felt a collective chill. They watched Ava as she moved through her day, her face a mask of stone, and they wondered what she would do. A formal complaint? A request for transfer? That night, in the quiet of her bunk, Ava didn't sleep. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, the phantom pain in her scalp a dull, persistent echo. She replayed the scene in her mind, and not with the victim's fear, but with a strategist's precision. A complaint to Lieutenant Coles would go nowhere. It would be his word against hers, and his rank would protect him. She would be labeled a troublemaker, his persecution would intensify, and her career would be over. That was the path of the victim. She wanted a different path. She wanted the path of the victor. The next morning, Ava woke before Reveille. She sat at her small desk with a pen and a notebook, the same kind she used for signal logs. For 2 hours, she wrote. She didn't write about her feelings or the injustice. She wrote a detailed, chronological account of every incident with Commander Thorne since her first day on the base. Dates, times, locations, witnesses, exact words spoken, the unwarranted critiques, the extra duties assigned to her alone, or the snide comments in front of other soldiers. She treated it like an intelligence report, factual, unemotional, and damning. Then she put the notebook in her locker and went to her duties, her demeanor unchanged. Thorne, emboldened by her silence, escalated his campaign. He found fault with her radio checks, claiming they were sloppy, though they were perfect. During a company run, he loudly remarked that she was slowing the unit down, even though she was keeping pace in the middle of the pack. He was trying to isolate her, to make her a pariah, to turn the collective frustration of the unit towards her. He was a master of psychological warfare, but he was using his skills on his own soldier. He was a bully, and bullies, for all their bluster, are often profoundly stupid. Ava's response was to become flawless. But she worked twice as hard. Her uniforms were sharper, her equipment was cleaner, her analysis was faster. She became a ghost of perfect military bearing, giving Thorne absolutely nothing to legitimately criticize. This infuriated him more than any defiance could have. His attacks became more personal, more desperate. A week after the hair pulling, Thorne called a special unit meeting. He stood before the assembled soldiers, his face grim. He announced that there had been a breach of protocol, a security lapse in the signals hut. He didn't provide details, but his eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Ava. Someone, he said, his voice dripping with implication, was not paying attention to their duties. This carelessness will not be tolerated. The responsible party will be identified and face severe consequences. It was a setup. And Ava knew it. The other soldiers knew it. A few of them shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The silence was a physical weight in the room. Thorne was laying the groundwork to blame her for something, anything, to justify her expulsion from the unit. He was confident in his power. He had the rank, the history, and the connections. She was just a private, a girl playing soldier. He dismissed them, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched Ava file out. He thought he had her cornered. He thought he had won. He was wrong. That evening, Ava retrieved her notebook. She had been adding to it, documenting the sham of a security meeting, Thorne's implicating glare, the oppressive silence of her peers. It was a complete dossier, but she knew that dropping it on Lieutenant Coles's desk would be a mistake. Coles was a good man, but he was also Thorne's subordinate. He would be forced to follow the chain of command, which would lead directly back to Thorne's allies. No, she needed to go higher. She needed a commander whose reputation was built on something other than battlefield glory. She needed the base's commanding officer, Colonel Walsh. Colonel Walsh was an enigma. A West Point graduate and a scholar of military history, he was known for his icy intellect and his absolute, unwavering commitment to the letter of the law. He was not a soldier's soldier in the traditional sense. He was a soldier's judge. He had little patience for incompetence and absolutely zero tolerance for actions that undermined unit cohesion or the integrity of the service. Getting an audience with him was nearly impossible for a private. But Ava had learned one crucial thing in the Signals Corps: how to find a back channel. She knew the colonel's aide-de-camp, a young lieutenant named Harris, from the mess hall. They had exchanged pleasantries a few times. She also knew, from routine signal traffic, that Colonel Walsh was expecting a sensitive, encrypted communication from division headquarters the next morning. It was a communication that would require a signals intelligence specialist to verify and log. The next morning, Ava volunteered for the duty of handling the incoming secure transmission. It was a routine task, but it placed her in the communications annex adjacent to the colonel's office. As she completed the verification, she asked Lieutenant Harris with perfect politeness if the colonel would like a hard copy of the authentication codes immediately, or if they could wait for the daily briefing. Harris, grateful for her efficiency, said he would ask. A moment later, he emerged. "The colonel will see you now, Private." Eva walked into the office, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face calm. Colonel Walsh was a lean, sharp-featured man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He took the printout from her, scanned it, and nodded. "Thank you, Private. That will be all." It was now or never. "Sir," Eva said, her voice steady, "if I may, I have a document I believe requires your personal attention. It concerns the operational readiness and internal security of this battalion." Walsh's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch. He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He saw a young private, standing at attention, holding a simple spiral notebook. He saw no fear in her eyes, or only a grim determination. He gestured to the edge of his desk. "Leave it." Ava placed the notebook down, saluted, and left the room. She had fired her shot. Now she could only wait. For 3 days, nothing happened. Thorne continued his petty tyranny, seemingly more confident than ever. He made a cruel joke at Ava's expense during a morning formation, and a few of his sycophants laughed. Ava stood rigid, staring straight ahead. The waiting was a new kind of torture. Doubt began to creep in. Had she been naive? Had Walsh simply thrown her notebook in the trash? Had she just signed her own death warrant? On the 4th day, the storm broke. It began with a terse announcement over the base intercom. "All personnel, report to the battalion parade ground immediately." The entire battalion assembled in confused silence, and the sun was high and brutal, baking the concrete. At the front of the formation stood Colonel Walsh, his face carved from granite. Beside him was the battalion commander, a nervous-looking colonel, and a stone-faced Lieutenant Coles. Commander Thorne was not in his usual position at the head of the company. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Colonel Walsh didn't use a microphone, but his voice carried in the heavy silence. "I have received a report," he began, his eyes sweeping across the assembled soldiers, "detailing a pattern of conduct unbecoming an officer, fraternization that borders on harassment, and the abuse of rank for personal gratification. This report was not filed through the expected channels, which tells me that the expected channels are broken." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Wow, the report was comprehensive. It contained dates, times, locations, and witnesses. It was not an emotional plea. It was a piece of intelligence work. He then did something that shocked everyone. He held up Eva's simple spiral notebook. This report came from one of your own, a private who, instead of succumbing to intimidation, chose to serve her unit in the highest possible way by holding its leaders accountable. He then turned his gaze to the officer corps. Commander Thorne. Thorne stepped forward from the back of the group, his face pale. He tried to muster his usual authoritative demeanor, but it crumbled under Walsh's icy stare. Commander Thorne, Walsh continued, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet that forced everyone to lean in. You are hereby relieved of your command and confined to quarters pending a full court-martial. The charges include conduct unbecoming an officer, dereliction of duty, and assault on a subordinate. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the flap of a flag in the hot wind. Every eye in the battalion turned from Thorne's ashen face to the figure of Private First Class Eva Rostova, standing at attention in the ranks. She didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist. She just stood there, a solitary figure, as Colonel Walsh turned and walked away, taking the notebook with him. That was the moment. The moment the commander who had yanked her hair was rendered speechless, not by a shouted insult or a physical blow, but by the quiet, irrefutable power of a well-documented truth. He had tried to break a soldier, and he had instead created the most dangerous thing in any army, a witness with a pen and the courage to use it. In the days that followed, the silence on the base was replaced by a new kind of sound. It was the sound of soldiers looking at each other differently. The whispers weren't about Eva's hair or her gender anymore. They were about the notebook. They were about Colonel Walsh's speech. They were about justice. Lieutenant Coles came to Eva personally. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply shook her hand and said, "Good work, Rostova." It was the first time he had ever called her by her last name, without a note of condescension. Other soldiers, the ones who had laughed at Thorne's jokes, now couldn't meet her eyes. The ones who had been silent found their voices, and a few of them came to her, quietly, to thank her. Then Eva didn't become a hero overnight. She didn't get a medal or a promotion. The military machine is slow to change. But something fundamental had shifted. The base's informal power structure, the unspoken rule that rank could shield cruelty, had been cracked. Commander Thorne's court-martial was swift. Witnesses who had been silent before now came forward, corroborating details from Eva's notebook. His career was over, disintegrated by the very arrogance that had once been its foundation. As for Eva, she requested a transfer, not because she was afraid, but because her work there was done. She was accepted into the Advanced Signals Intelligence course, a prestigious program she had earned on merit. On her last day on the base, she stood in the same spot on the parade ground where the battalion had assembled. The sun was setting, and painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A young private, a woman who had arrived just after the incident, approached her hesitantly. "Private Rostova," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did. It makes it easier." Eva looked at the young woman, seeing a reflection of her own former self, but with perhaps a little less fear in her eyes. She thought of the notebook, now locked away in some evidence file. She thought of the pain in her scalp, a memory already fading. She thought of the silence she had faced, and the silence she had created. She simply nodded at the private. "Just do your job," she said, "and keep a notebook." She walked away from the base, not as a victim with a story, but as a soldier who had completed a difficult mission. She had faced an enemy, not on a foreign battlefield, but within her own ranks, and she had won, not with superior firepower, but with an unshakable will and the quiet, devastating power of the truth. The commander who had tried to break her was left with nothing but the memory of a silent girl in a chair and the thunderous sound of his own world collapsing.